Good evening, and a very warm welcome this evening. And let me take this opportunity to wish you all very happy holidays. And this seems like a particularly appropriate lecture to end our fall season on. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the New York Landmarks Conservancy in promoting this lecture. I don't know, for any of you, is this your first visit to the General Society? Okay, well, a few. So if you don't mind, I'm going to give a brief overlook of the Society. We were founded in 1785, 234 years ago, by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. These included 22 artisans. Today, our organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our General Society Library, of course, which you're sitting in, and you will find membership information on the front table. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Collection, which you can see upstairs and you're welcome to visit after tonight's talk. And finally, our lecture series, which is now nearly 200 years old, and of course of which tonight's lecture is part of. Our speaker this evening is John Tauranac, who will be discussing his book, Manhattan's Little Secrets, which will also be for sale this evening, as well as some other books written by John. John Tauranac writes on New York City's social and architectural history. He has taught the subject for over 30 years at NYU's School of Professional Studies. He gives tours and lectures of the city, and he designs maps. His books include Manhattan's Little Secrets, of course, and the Empire State Building, The Making of a Landmark. The 3 editions of New York from the Air with the great aerial photographer, Jan Arthur Bertrand, and Elegant New York. John has also written many articles for many publications, and in fact, he even wrote about our Mossman Lock collection in an article he did for New York Magazine. John's first published maps were New York Magazine's undercover maps of Midtown and Lower Manhattan, which showed passageways to take through an underbuilding to stay warm in the cold and dry in the wet. You can see he's the perfect person to unveil Manhattan's secrets. He was also creative director of the 1979 MTA subway map. I am now so pleased to introduce to you John Tauranac. Thank you.
I think that after that intro, I'm not going to say a word. We are going to talk about Manhattan's Little Secrets tonight, and I'm going to start with this one. Does anybody recognize this statue? It's on Riverside Drive and 93rd Street. And I call it the Stones of Rouen. I call the article in the book the Stones of Rouen. Why? Because there was a castle in Rouen, and despite what this caption says in French, it was not destroyed in 1590. Some of it remained, and it was in this prison that the British imprisoned Joan of Arc. And in 1912, the determination was that the balance of the building would be destroyed. And the tower you see is the only remaining element of it. 1912 also just happened to be the 500th anniversary of the birth of Joan of Arc. And a committee of New Yorkers, Francophiles all, wanted to erect a statue in her memory. When they learned that the walls that had imprisoned Joan were about to be taken down, they determined that some of the stones from Joan's donjon would be just the thing to serve as the base for the statue of Joan of Arc. And here are some of the stones of Rouen serving as the base of the statue. John Van Pelt, who was an architect who taught at both Cornell and Columbia, did not always practice what he preached. He said that using an anachronistic style of architecture was a mistake in both logic and taste. He did say, however, that there were exceptions. For a Roman Catholic cathedral, Gothic is perfectly appropriate, even in the 20th century. So consider this, Joan's Cathedral. This man was the committee president, and he was perhaps the least affluent of the committee members. He was George Kunz, K-U-N-Z, the nation's foremost expert on precious stones and the head of the diamond department of this store. Does anybody recognize this store? The building still stands on Fifth Avenue. Tiffany. You see the statue of Atlas there? When they moved uptown to 57th Street, they took the Atlas with them. Kunz was also an honorary curator at the American Museum of Natural History, and he was a graduate of Cooper Union. He was a patron of the National Sculpture Society, a member of the City History Club, and he was president of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society, a proto-architectural preservation group. He knew the city, he knew sculpture, and he knew the stuff it stands on. And he lived here in the Hendrick Hudson Apartments on Riverside Drive between 110th and 11th. Another member was MacDougall Hawkes. Hawkes was the director of the nascent Museum of French Art. He only had degrees from Columbia in engineering, political science, and law. Hawkes just happened to be married to Eva Van Cortlandt Morris of Morrisania, which means she was a member of the family that owned about a quarter of the Bronx. They lived at 80 East 50th Street, right here, in a 25-foot wide row house that practically filled its entire lot. Down the block was St. Thomas, the Society Church, and Vanderbilt Mansions, etc. And here's a view of their corner. This is just about their house. As part of his Francophilism in 1912, Hawkes hosted a luncheon at the Metropolitan Club honoring a French delegation to celebrate the Champlain Tercentenary. This man, the former Senator William A. Clark of Montana, aka the Copper King, was on the committee, and luncheon was followed by a visit to Clark's modest house on the northeast corner of Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. It's the Beaux-Arts extravaganza of all Beaux-Arts extravaganzas. It was torn down in the 20s. Clark had 6 paintings of Joan of Arc by Boutet de Monvel hanging on his walls. And this is the title page from a book illustrated by the artist. A year later, Hawkes hosted a reception for the French ambassador at the Ritz-Carlton on Madison Avenue between 46th and 47th Streets. Senator Clark was at the luncheon, along with J. Sanford Saltus, the committee's honorary chairman. Saltus was a patron of the arts in general. He established prizes at the Art Students League and the National Academy. Statues don't come cheap, and he contributed $20,000, or about $500,000 in today's money, to the cause. He could afford it. His father owned and operated Saltus Steel. But he was most interested in numismatics, and he established the Saltus Award for numismatics. Do you see the W here on the medal? That stands for Weinman, Adolf Alexander Weinman. Does that name ring any bells? He only did all the sculpture on Penn Station. Some of it is in the Jersey swamps and the bits in the Brooklyn Museum. He was also the designer of the winged Mercury head dime. In order to drum up more funds for the statue, Saltus arranged for the American Numismatic Society at Audubon Terrace to host what was billed as the most extensive exhibition of material, quote, ever brought together anywhere in the world. There were about 1,000 articles in all, and one of Clark's paintings by Monvel was there, and Saltus himself contributed about 100 medals. Saltus died a mysterious death in London in 1922, and in the same year this book, The Statues of New York, which as far as I can determine was the first book devoted entirely to the subject, was published with him as the lead co-author. And the sculpture itself, there never was any actual competition held, and the sculptor, Anna von Hyatt, seems to have been the odds-on favorite from the outset. Hyatt's father was a zoologist at MIT, and her natural proclivity was to sculpt animals. In 1900, at about 25, she came to New York to study. By 1906, one of her animal sculptures was already in the Metropolitan Museum. She had started thinking about an equestrian statue of Joan when she was in Paris, and she had needed a model for the horse, a horse strong enough to bear the weight of someone in armor. She found a percheron, which were used as dray horses, and she found it in the stables of the Bon Marché department store. Those are the same horses that Rosa Bonheur painted for the horse fair. The equestrian statue of Joan was in clay, and she exhibited it at the Paris Salon of 1910. Curiously, she did not take first place, and the jurors confessed why. They were incredulous that a woman sculptor with a woman assistant could have done such a massive piece of work. Curiously, Saltus had been there at the Salon, and he saw it, and that was it. Anna von Hyatt became the sculptor of the statue of Joan of Arc. That was all that was needed. She went to work at the family's vacation property in Annisquam, Massachusetts, where she found another percheron at a local firehouse. And here's a view of the finished product from a similar perspective. Although the reins on the horse are loosely held, the horse's head, the horse's raised foreleg, the angle of his head, and his tense muscles all convey energy. And Joan stands forward in the saddle, the visor of her helmet raised, her eye on the hilt of the sword that she holds on high. The cross guard of the hilt creates a cross, the perfect symbol for Joan. And the armor? The consultant on the armor was Bashford Dean. Dean had been fascinated by armor as a boy, but he started his professional life as a zoologist. He was an expert on the armored fish of the Devonian period, and he taught at Columbia, where he would wow his students with his ability to take a piece of chalk in each hand, go to the blackboard, and working simultaneously and with equal dexterity, draw an example of an armored fish. A serious study of armor was a logical extension of zoology, and Dean became the first curator of armor at the Metropolitan Museum. And here's a segue into another subject. Ignore the cabs and hot dog stands and look at the building. Have you ever noticed those stones atop the paired columns? As a kid, I thought they represented pyramids, and they were there to pay homage to the great collection of Egyptian art within. And I wasn't far off. The stones of the Met were put up there to be carved in situ, each group representing a period of art. The problem is that by the time they got around to carving the stones, the $1 million allocated for the East Wing was used up, and the stones never were carved. And they're still just sitting there. But back to Joan. The armor on Joan was modeled on the finest period of the armorer's art, 15th century Italian, and the model came from Dean's private collection. He lived on the grounds of Wave Hill in northern Riverdale, and he built this wing to be his armory, his private armory. He could afford it. Dean is another who married into New York royalty. He married Alice Dykeman of Dykeman House. A protagonist who unwittingly set the stage for some of this story was Archer Huntington. He was the stepson of the railroad man Collis Huntington, and he was heir to the Huntington fortune. It was Huntington who provided the land on Upper Broadway for Audubon Terrace, the site of the Joan of Arc exhibition, and it was the setting for the American Numismatics Society, which Huntington had founded. And here's how the story comes full circle with another royal marriage. In 1922, Huntington wanted to have a medal cast to honor the Argentine statesman Bartholomew Mitre. Huntington knew Hyatt's work, but he had never met her. When they did meet to discuss the project, something seemed familiar about her, and he asked if they had ever met. She said, "On the train coming from Westchester to Grand Central. We see each other every day." A year later, they were married in her studio at 49 West 12th Street. Of course, she got the commission to do the medal honoring Mitre, and she created the statuary for the courtyard of Audubon Terrace. The Grand Central that Hyatt and Huntington knew was almost identical with the one we know today. Granted, this view does not show the bridge over 42nd Street, but it does show the elevated circumferential driveway, aka the Ring Road. And over here, on the corner of Vanderbilt and 42nd Street, you find this eagle today. Has anybody ever noticed it? One of us has. And you find another eagle above the entrance to the Grand Central Markets on Lexington Avenue. And if you're wondering why they are there, they were originally on this building, which is the second Grand Central on the site. When that building was torn down and replaced by today's, the eagles metaphorically flew the coop to find new perches, and these two have been retrieved. We forget what Park Avenue looked like north of the station for the last 3 decades of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th. There were rail yards. I mean, where's the Park Avenue we know today? Here are the steeples of St. Patrick's. The Hawks family lived up here, all within sound of the rail yards. In the second half of the 19th century, this had been the edge of the city. The F&M Schaefer Brewery was on the site of today's St. Bartholomew Church. I used to live in Yorkville, and Rupert was up there. And the product might be wonderful, but the aroma of beer is something else. So you can imagine what 52nd and Park smelled like in 1900. Further up Park Avenue, between 52nd and 53rd, was the Steinway Piano Company. That's the site of today's Seagram Building. Because the tracks were so, pay attention here, the tracks were at grade. They weren't sunken or anything. They were right there at street level. Because the tracks were so hazardous at grade level, they were put in an open cut with bridges across them. And further north, between about 60th Street and 97th, the cut was even more covered. Now, this is the early 20th century. They were still operating steam-powered trains, which meant the tunnels would be filled not just with steam, but with what? With smoke. So the inevitable happened one day. An engineer ran a red light because he couldn't see it, and the resulting crash was disastrous. And the city had already entered the scene in the 1860s when they said to Cornelius Vanderbilt and the New York Central Railroad, "Thou shalt bring no steam engines into Manhattan south of 42nd Street." That's why Grand Central is where it is. Well, after the crash, the city entered the scene again and said, "Thou shalt bring no steam engines into Manhattan on the east side, period." They didn't give a fig about the west side. Trains operated on 10th and 11th Avenues all the way down to Chambers Street. But on the east side, no steam engines, which would have cut out passenger service. New York Central would have had to have dumped passengers in the Bronx and schlepped them down to Midtown somehow. And that's how Grand Central got to be where it is. This is the first Grand Central on the site, but it proved too small for the railroad by the 1890s. And this is the second on the site. And here are the eagles. There are 3 eagles in each corner. They didn't bother putting an eagle at the back because nobody would see it. But this building, enlarged as it was more for bureaucratic purposes than for passengers, and it was declared too small. So down it came. And you see a test electric locomotive here. And this man standing here in the light suit is William J. Wilgus. He was the chief engineer of the New York Central Railroad. Today, his education might qualify him as a mail boy. He had a high school diploma and he had taken 1 correspondence course in drafting from Cornell. But he was brilliant. The first thing he said is that with the electrification of the railroad, we can have a bi-level terminal. We can have local trains coming in on the lower level and express long-distance trains coming in on the upper level. Who remembers the Latin word for baggage? Good. Impedimenta. What is a greater impediment to travel than having to schlep your impedimenta? So if you're traveling a long distance with a lot of baggage, you don't have to go down a flight of stairs. And even in today's Grand Central, you don't have to set foot on stairs anyway. You can take ramps. It's one of the great breakthroughs in transportation design. When people extol the virtues of Penn Station, I always remind them of all the stairs you had to climb in Penn Station. Anyway, he said, we can have a bi-level terminal. Suddenly, Park Avenue can be open to traffic. It had been closed, right, because of the train yards. He said we had to allow traffic to pass around or under or through the terminal somehow. And he said, you can stand and straddle a model train. You will not fall down with the model train operating between your legs. He said skyscrapers can do the same thing with full-size trains. He said that all that land that has been laying fallow, used for train yards, with the air only dissipating the steam and smoke, you can build skyscrapers there. And you can have the trains operating between the piers, the posts, the legs of the skyscrapers. He said, it's alchemy, pure and simple. From the very air will come gold in the form of rentals. So the New York Central was embarked on the largest real estate project in the history of the city in the early 20th century. Now, of course, there was an architectural competition. The firm that designed this building, which is across the street from us, the Harvard Club, McKim, Mead & White, entered with this plan. It's a neoclassical structure. You can see that there are holes punched in the building to allow Park Avenue traffic. And this tower is probably very vaguely reminiscent. Think of the municipal building. Well, McKim, Mead & White was the most prestigious architectural firm at the turn of the 20th century. They lost, in part because they did not take advantage of Wilgus's plan north of the terminal. All of this is just waste space. He said you can build buildings on it with the tracks below. Another firm entered the building. Warren and Wetmore, who designed the New York Yacht Club, which is just west of us on the other side of the street. Theirs is a more Beaux-Artsy design, and it does have a ring, it does have a ring road around it. They too lost two of the most prestigious architectural firms in the city. The little-known firm of Reed and Stem, who were in Minneapolis, Minnesota, entered and won. For starters, they put a skyscraper on top of the terminal. Money making, right? They had an elevated circumferential plaza, which is just what Wilgus really wanted. And these semi-elliptical arches might be vaguely familiar because you see them in today's terminal. It just happens that it was either Reed or Stem, I can never remember which one, was the brother-in-law of William J. Wilgus. So everything Wilgus wanted, Wilgus got. And north, they didn't avail themselves of skyscrapers, but they had a court of honor, very much like Audubon Terrace. By 1907, they were digging, and they had to dig pretty deep in order to accommodate a bi-level terminal. And this is the way it looked. You can recognize some of the buildings here. This is the Belmont Hotel. This is the terminal, the depot here. This is Grand Central Palace, which was being built over the tracks. But mirabile dictu, Reed and Stem's plan was thrown away, and this design by the firm of Warren and Wetmore was declared the winner, and they were going to design it in conjunction with Reed and Stem. Reed and Stem's role was relegated to engineering. They didn't get the glory of designing the building itself. And this was the work of Whitney and Warren and Whitney. Nepotism raised its head again. Whitney Warren was a cousin of the Vanderbilts. So nepotism pays off, doesn't it? This elevation doesn't look terribly familiar, does it? This drawing, however, begins to ring bells with you, I'm sure. And here is actual construction. Here is Park Avenue with the median. This is the Ritz-Carlton. Does anybody recognize this building? It's long gone, but this had been an athletic club, and it was used by Louis Comfort Tiffany when this was going on. This is the Biltmore Hotel going up. This is the Belmont Hotel on 42nd and Park. And this is the 45th Street facade of Grand Central Terminal. And here's the famous Palm Court in the Biltmore Hotel. And there's the famous clock, which I also write about in the book. Now, you're probably stunned to think that trains actually operated under apartment houses such as the Marguerite. This is 270 Park, between 47th and 48th. And the Marguerite was one of the most elegant apartment houses in the city. It was torn down in the era when probably about 1959, 60, and the Union Carbide building went up on the site. My first job was in the Marguerite. I was a delivery boy for Gristides. And this is the way Park Avenue looked by 1930. Who would recognize it? I mean, think of what this looked like 35, 40 years before. And here is a hint of it. This photograph, looking through a grate, down to the tracks, is about a foot away from the wall of the Waldorf Astoria on 49th Street and Park. And it explains why you take an escalator or a flight of stairs up to the lobby floor in the Waldorf. Where do you put the housing for elevators if the lobby's on the first floor? You don't. You put you put them on the first floor, and you put the lobby on the second floor. Now, here we go with schlepping impedimenta again. Schultz and Weaver were very wise hotel architects. They would never have put a lobby on the second floor unless they had had to. Now, here's another famous building. This is the main branch of the New York Public Library. This postcard was published before the library was finished. You don't see the pedimental sculpture on the north and south pavilions, nor do you see the statues of the lions who guard the entrance. The architects were Carrere and Hastings. This is John Mervyn Carrere, and this is Thomas Hastings. They had met each other at l'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and they came back to New York, and they worked with McKim, and White. Then they branched out on their own, and they designed this building. Does anybody recognize it? It's on 31st Street between 5th and 6th. It is now the Herald Square Hotel. But can you make out this word? Life. This was Life magazine. It was started by a Harvard boy, and it was a comedic magazine, and all sorts of famous artists worked for Life. And Henry Luce bought it in the 20s, the 30s, and changed the approach of Life magazine to a photo. Now, Carrere and Hastings obviously needed a sculptor for the southern and northern pediments of the library, and they were clearly inclined to stick with their own kind. And they found a sculptor with old school ties. They found George Gray Barnard, who had graduated from the Beaux-Arts. And while he was in Paris, he had done this statue, Struggle in the Two Natures of Man. And he entered it in the 1894 Salon. And the statue was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in 1897, it was sitting in an outbuilding of the Met. Why? Because at 8 feet around, it was too big to get in any door of the museum. He also did the sculpture of Pan on the Columbia campus. I know we have at least one Columbia boy in the audience who knows this statue. It's just east of Low Library. And here we see a picture of the pedimental sculpture in place. And when the architect Hastings saw a model of one of the sculpture groups, he was said to have described it. Notice the passive tense. He was said to have described it as the finest thing that had ever been done in this country. And when the scaffolding came down at the end of 1913, Barnard's sculpture was no doubt viewed as straight out of the lesson books at l'École. The Times described history, the sculpture in the northern pediment, as including a reclining figure, this is their words, a reclining figure of a knight in armor, resting upon the book of life, as he dreams of war and victory, while an allegorical female figure is writing the records of life. But there's something terribly wrong with this statuary group. Art students, especially sculpture students, are expected to study anatomy. And art students, such as in art schools, such as the Art Students League, where Barnard taught, and the National Academy, where he was an associate member, often offer anatomy courses as an integral part of the curriculum. Where that knight's right arm is coming from is the $64,000 question. Perhaps for argument's sake, it can't all be blamed on Barnard. The sculptors who worked on the library did not do the actual carving. They delivered full-size models of their work to stone carvers. In this case, the firm of Donnelly and Ritchie. Donnelly and Ritchie at the same time they were carving Barnard's work, were carving the statuary group atop Grand Central Terminal. They were also responsible for the statuary on the Woolworth Building. Clearly, they were up to the job. Because of bureaucratic entanglements, Although Hastings had contracted with Donnelly and Ritchie, it was Barnard who was responsible for their $4,000 bill. He refused to pay it. Donnelly and Ritchie sued, so Barnard countersued. He said their work was defective, that it was botched, it was even an insult to nature, a disgrace to the library, and a stain on my reputation. Donnelly and Ritchie provided photographs of Barnard's model in court, and that was it. The group today is as it was. Curiously, in all the backing and forthing, all the litigiousness, there was no word of complaint from Barnard on the misshapen shoulder. I've also come to appreciate the hand on the top of the woman writing life. But there's a side to George Gray Barnard aside from his own sculpture, and that is the work of medieval sculptors and architects. While at the Beaux-Arts, he used to pedal his bicycle around the French countryside, acquiring bits and pieces of Gothic art, as he would say, for a song. He even took an occasional cloister. He came to house some of it in the stable of Cornelius King Garrison Billings in Washington Heights. It's the same Billings who wanted to have a dinner on horses in his stable, but he couldn't manage that, so he went to Sherry's. As early as November 1914, Barnard was opening his collection of medieval art to the public. And what do you think happened to it? John D. Rockefeller Jr. came along. He bought it from Barnard, bought the property, and we now have the cloisters. And it's all thanks to Barnard. All of which begs the question of how Barnard, who did not apparently come from money, his grandfather had been a merchant, but his father was a minister, and they're not known for avariciousness. How he could have managed to acquire so much stuff without a sizable income is a mystery. And both Struggle of Man and Pan had essentially been commissioned by Alfred Corning Clark. He was the son and heir of Edward Clark, who owned whole swaths of the Upper West Side and who built the Dakota Apartments. In fact, Pan was originally intended to be for the Dakota, but they gave both statues away. Now, here's an unsung building. It's just around the corner on 43rd between 5th and 6th. This is Firehouse Engine Company number 65, and it was designed by Hoppin and Cohn. Hoppin and Cohn were not Warren and Wetmore or McKinley and White. However, they were very good architects. Napoleon Lebrun was basically the house architect for the fire department in the 1890s and early 20th century. But Hoppin and Cohn did go on to design the police headquarters on Center Street in 1909. Amidst all the neoclassical tchotchkes on the firehouse around the corner, there is this fret here, and it includes an ancient symbol that when removed and tipped 45 degrees still sends shudders down our spines. I'm talking, of course, about the swastika. You also find another ancient symbol, a salamander. This is not your garden variety salamander. Nor is it the symbol of Francis I, whose salamanders bore a crown atop their heads, and they adorn Francis I-ified buildings here in New York. This is the Alwyn Court on 6th Avenue and 58th Street. This is a fire-breathing salamander, and you wonder why it's appropriate on a firehouse. This building, today's Bryant Park Hotel on 40th Street, was originally the American Radiator Building. You find a fire-breathing salamander on it, but it makes sense. Their products were furnaces and heaters, which generated heat. And a salamander is even the name for a grill atop a professional stove. In Fahrenheit 451, that dystopian novel, the firemen started fires to burn books, and their fire trucks were called salamanders. and they had the makings of fire in their bellies. And the firemen had salamanders as symbols on their uniforms, which begs the question of why salamanders would be on this firehouse. And the answer is that a mythical salamander could do more than start fires. They could also withstand great heat, and they happily inhabited fire, or fiery places such as the volcano of Mount Etna, where they could have survived without being scorched. Mythical salamanders were able to survive in fire because they were colder than any other creature. And when a salamander was frightened, it would exude a liquid that moistened its skin, a liquid that could also extinguish a fire. A salamander on the firehouse suddenly makes eminently good sense. Now, if we go downtown to 33 Great Joan Street, which might be a street you don't know, but west of Broadway, it becomes West 3rd, was where Bernard Beinecke built some stables. Bernard Beinecke was a wholesale butcher whose career began in New York as a 19-year-old German immigrant in 1865. Some of his business by the 1870s included making deliveries directly to his clients. So, of course, he needed horse-drawn wagons as delivery vans, along with a place to house them, which explains this 3-story stable between the Bowery and what is now Lafayette Street. Here's a view of the site from an 1894 Bromley, and this is the stable. It has an X through it, which in land maps indicates stables, and it's pink, which indicates it's brick. If you see yellow, it indicates a wood building. So Beinecke's stables were brick. And here's a photograph of Bernard Beinecke in the 1890s, friendly fellow, yes. By the 1890s, he was pretty successful. He operated the Eastman's Dressed Beef Company right here, between 58th and 59th on the Hudson River. And he was supplying transatlantic steamships and institutions and hotels with victuals. And by then he had realized he could do better than simply supply hotels. He could build and own one. So he built the Manhattan Hotel on the northwest corner of 42nd Street and Vanderbilt Avenue. And he had no less than Henry J. Hardenberg design it. Hardenberg had just finished the Waldorf Astoria on Fifth Avenue, which had opened to great huzzas. Like the Waldorf, the Manhattan was clearly a success, and an extension was built to 43rd Street. It was ideally situated only a block away from Grand Central. And here is some sculpture groups on the roof line, and here's a detail. This building is long gone. It was torn down in about 1950, and he had closed down the Hotel Manhattan in the early 1920s. Why did so many hotels go out of business in the early 1920s? The Volstead Act. Prohibition. Hotels are dependent on the income of restaurants, and restaurants are dependent on the income of the bar. Without the bar, there was no income flowing in. The Manhattan went out of business. The Knickerbocker down the block from us on 42nd and Broadway went out of business. The Waldorf closed down in 1928. You can blame it on the Volstead Act. Beinecke also bought a hotel. Do you recognize this hotel? Do you recognize its site? Well, this is Central Park, this is 59th Street, and this is Fifth Avenue. This is the first Plaza Hotel on the site. It was built in 1890. It was designed by McKim, White. And Beinecke wanted something bigger and grander. And he was soon in partnership with a man named Harry S. Black of the Fuller Construction Company. Fuller had built this building on the triangular block created by the confluence of Broadway and Fifth Avenue between 22nd and 23rd Streets, which came to be called the Flatiron Building, in part because the triangular piece of property had been dubbed the Flatiron. Now, The block is a right triangle, isn't it? When was the last time you used a right triangled iron? Irons are isosceles triangles, aren't they? So it's a misnomer, but we'll let that go. Beinecke and Fuller created a corporation called the United States Realty Company. And they had on their board several local politicians and judges, etc. People we would today describe as big machas. What they wanted to do was tear down the Trinity building, tear down the Boreal building, tear down these anonymous buildings. They wanted to shift Thames Street about 20 feet further north to give them two equal width sites, and they wanted to close Little Temple Street. And with the board behind them, what do you think happened? This is how it looks today. Sure enough, Thames Street is here. You have to take a left and then a right to return to Thames Street. Where's Temple Street? It's gone, isn't it? And you have two almost equally wide sites for the United States Realty Building and the Trinity Building. And here are the buildings today. By building nearly twin towers, they saved a potload of money. You know, one form fits all. And they were off to making a fortune. With that kind of clout, this modest hotel was sure to go, to be replaced by something grander. And Bernard Beinecke and Harry Black met with John Bettermillion Gates for tea at the St. Regis Hotel. John Bettermillion Gates had made a fortune in barbed wire, and he was known as a great gambler, but he would also bet on sure things like the future Plaza Hotel. If he was on a train and was raining, he would bet with his seatmate which droplet of rain would reach the bottom of the pane first. But he was also a very serious businessman. Beinecke saw that Henry J. Hardenberg was hired again, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner of this postcard, and here's today's Plaza Hotel. U.S. Realty went on to build the Copley Plaza in Boston, and in the 1920s they decided to tear down the old Savoy on the east side of Fifth Avenue between 58th and 59th and put up the new Savoy Plaza, which was designed by the residual firm of McKim, Mead & White, and it opened in 1927. Beinecke was in his 80s by then, and according to his grandson, Beinecke had been opposed to the construction of the Savoy Plaza, which was, quote, built in a wave of enthusiasm in the 1920s. The Depression set in, and my grandfather, who had moved to the plaza, sat in the window in his last years and watched everything go. He ended up the way he started, broke. Well, broke is a relative thing. The family retained an interest in Fuller, which was the largest building construction company in the United States, part of the consortium, for instance, that built the United Nations. And one member of the second generation of Beineckes founded Sperry and Hutchinson, which distributed S&H green stamps, the trading stamps that grocery stores used to hand out instead of discounts. The third generation of Beineckes created a memorial to the second generation of Beineckes, the children of Bernard Beinecke, and they built a library at Yale, which Walter Beinecke modestly described as something modest. It's the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, as depicted here by Adam Van Dorn. You find this in his wonderful book, The Stones of Yale. And on that upbeat note, I was meant to talk for an hour. It's 7:25. So, I've made a deal with Karen. I am a lousy question answerer. I'll take 3. And if I can answer them yes, no, maybe, I'd be very happy. Adam.
I'm sure it's a. This one? Oh, okay. I'm sure it's a sore subject, but I'm convinced, obviously, that there were many things that you left out for reasons of publishing the book on the size. Were there a couple that you could mention that you felt particularly, was it particularly difficult to leave out?
How many hours do you have? One of my favorites. Do you remember the movie Mr. 880? No. He was a counterfeiter. And the United States Secret Service came to refer to his file as Old 880. He only counterfeited $1 bills. And he used paper that you could get at Staples to print. He lived on the top floor of a tenement on 96th Street between Amsterdam and Broadway. And he had a little printing press up there. He had been trained as a printer in his youth. He emigrated from Europe. He worked as a janitor and a superintendent here. He was widowed. His children were gone. He was a garbage man. And he figured, I have my dog to feed and my rent to pay. So, $1 here, $1 there. Sure enough, he would print dollar bills in his tenement apartment. And he spelled Washington, Wahsington. He would never fob off one of his counterfeit dollars at the same place twice because he didn't think it was fair. His assumption was that he could fob off these single dollar bills because nobody takes a look at a dollar bill. I mean, today, you go to Stop and Shop or the A&P or something, and you give a cashier a $100 bill, and they'll hold it up to the light. They take a piece of newspaper for a $1 bill. So he was doing this for years, and sometimes he would take kids in the neighborhood to Coney Island and treat them to rides, and he was finally caught because there was a fire in his apartment, and the fireman threw stuff out the window into the back lot, among which was his printing press and some samples of his dollar bills, and some kids were playing in the lot, and they immediately said, this is theater money, this is toy stuff. And they, some of the kids took it home and showed it to their parents, and one of the parents talked with his son and learned where this had been, and he went to the police on 100th Street, and the police called the Secret Service, and I like to say that a chorus of bingo went around the Secret Service. They finally got their man, and he was found guilty, and he served 3 months in jail, and he was fined $1. So that didn't make it. I love that story. A movie, it was a story that ran in the New Yorker. It was, a 2 or 3 part story in 1948 or so. I forget the writer's name, but it was metamorphosed into a movie. Edmund Gwenn played the Mr. 880. Burt Lancaster was the Secret Service man. It's a great story. It didn't make it. Another sort of a tragedy, I'll bet many of you know about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. You probably know the building in which it took place. Do you know the church? The picnic was sponsored by a church on East 6th Street, a Presbyterian church. No, sorry, Lutheran church. And it was part of Klein Deutschland. And the picnics were held midweek, and it explains why there were so few men on the, do you know the basic story? There was a picnic. They went from the foot of 3rd Street and the East River with a destination on the north shore of Long Island. and it was a side-wheeler, steam-powered, named the General Slocum. Slocum was on the staff of General Sherman, who burned his way through Georgia. And he was the side-wheeler named the Slocum, ironically. It caught fire while just passing the northern end of what was then called, what island? It's now well called Roosevelt Island. It's now called Roosevelt. Caught fire, and the captain said, well, we'll beach the burning ship in the South Bronx, but there were many lumber yards there, and he thought that'd start a conflagration. So he opted for North Brother Island, which is an island in sort of the merging waters between the East River and Long Island Sound. By the time he got there, there were over 1,000 people dead. And the church found itself basically without a congregation. And many of the mourning remaining family members moved. Many of them simply got on the 2nd or 3rd Avenue well and went to 86th Street and settled in Yorkville, which explains one of the reasons that Yorkville had such a large German population in the early part of the 20th century. The church is still there. It's now a synagogue. And it's on East 6th Street, the land of Indian restaurants. So I wrote about that. I can't tell you how much text was cut from this book. It was probably twice as long originally. If anybody is a publisher and wants to do a sequel, let me know. So that was a much longer answer than I had anticipated giving. We have 2 more to go. Good, no takers. Oh, shoot.
There's on your cover, the statue of the Pietà. What is that?
Up at the top?
Yeah, third one down on the right.
Oh, on the right, the
Yeah.
Pietà? You probably think that that's in the Vatican, but it ain't. It's in St. Vincent Ferrer Church on Lexington Avenue and 66th Street. And, the Vatican did send the Pietà to New York for the World's Fair in 1964 and 5. And it was the hokiest thing. I mean, it was in blue light with a circle of lights around the statue, which was described as a halo. And if you saw the statue and paid the ordinary freight, you would stand on a moving conveyor belt because they were afraid that too many people would clog the place and it'd be too crowded. So they just had you move, and there were 3 levels of the conveyor belt, and you passed by it, I don't know how fast, 5-10 miles an hour. So you got a glimpse of the Pietà, and you were out. And they collected their money, and it went to the Vatican. This statue is, there's a signature on the cincture of Madonna because. Buonarroti, what's his name? Come on, who did it? Michelangelo, thank you. Michelangelo heard people from Milan saying that the statue had been done by a fellow Milanese, and it irked him. So he sneaked into he sneaked into the Vatican one night and he carved on the cincture, "This is the work of Michelangelo, Florence." This statue does not have that on the cincture. In fact, I cannot find a signature of the sculptor who did it. It's about 2/3 the size of the original, but it's terrific. I mean, in every respect, and you can walk right up to it. You know, if you go to the Vatican today, you're kept away, you know, some crazy guy tried to attack it, and they have it behind bulletproof plexiglass. You really can't get up close to it. You can get right up close to this Pieta, and it is, it's free. Okay, one more. Oh.
Are you from New York?
The question is, am I from New York?
Are you, yes, did you grow up in New York?
I like to say bred and born.
Me too.
Yes, in fact, one of the subjects in the book is the fact that on the wall of PS 158, it says Avenue A. I went to PS 158.
Wonderful.
Avenue A is now York Avenue. Has nothing to do with the fact that it's in the middle of Yorkville. It's because of Sergeant York.
I had the good pleasure of meeting his, thanks to Howard Tisch, who's in the audience this evening, who has done many a commemoration activity for the heroes of World War I. The grandson of Sergeant York and the great-granddaughter of Sergeant York, we celebrated with them at the Park Avenue Armory, as well as Gary Cooper's daughter who was
Really?
there. Yeah, so it was a beautiful night.
Well, Sergeant York had dozens of things named in his honor, and whether he ever attended any of those memorials, I don't know, but he did not attend the naming of Avenue A in his honor. He was a very modest man, and it didn't go to his head.
I know, and it's an incredible story.
Yeah.
Again, I'm grateful to Howard for helping that story to be brought to light. So.
Thank you.
John? Before you all get up, we'd just like to make a presentation to John. John, first of all, I want to thank you for your incredible in-depth knowledge of New York City. It was a revelation, to quote your own publicity, revelations of history that is hidden in plain view. I kept thinking all the buildings, I should look up and see all the things that you have noticed. And really, your knowledge and expertise, we're so delighted to have you speak here this evening. So thank you so much. And we would like to make a presentation, and to do so will be Victoria Dangle, our Executive Director.
Yes, John, thank you so much. That's wonderful. As a native New Yorker, I am especially thrilled. I can't get enough details about New York, and I can't help but look at those images and that you so beautifully put together, those precious pictures, now that photography is so easy and it's so bountiful. I was really thinking about how precious each of those images were to those individuals and how beautiful the photographs were. It was really so enjoyable. So thank you so much. Every detail was beautiful. And I want to give you years ago you sent me an article. We were talking and the Mossman mention came up, and you sent me the article that was from the early 80s of New York, from New York Magazine, called High Noon and Nothing to Do. So I'd really like to thank you for that wonderful mention and how you really described the Mossman Law collection so beautifully. So thank you so much. So, John, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to John Tauranac, author for Manhattan's Little Secrets, Uncovering Mysteries in Brick and Mortar, Glass and Stone, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. So thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And before we go back, and John signs copies of his books, I just want to also thank the audience and all of you who came this evening to support the book, but also to support the General Society. to look out, and when Karen said, how many of you have not been here before, and it was just a few people, so it really means a lot that you keep coming back. We really appreciate it, so thank you.
And because we like to do to all our speakers to never let them go, John, you are now a lifetime member of the General Society Library.
Well, thank you.